like to do for the final panel is have a discussion about really, as we talk about innovation, as we talk about this world dedicated toward innovating on what I talked about, the third platform, we want to really talk about the realities of how you get that done and how you build a structure that can honor the governance principles of your organization, but also be innovative and drive innovation throughout the organization. So I've got a great panel to talk about this. Again, first I've got Colin McDonald, who's Government Chief Information Officer for New Zealand. Nice to thank you.
Hi, Crawford.
Thanks very much for attending. Chris Vian, you just heard from, Chief Innovation Officer for the World Bank. Dr. Peter Wilton, who we heard from this morning, Senior Lecturer, Haas School of Business, and Andrew Lam Potang, Chief Information and Technology Officer for Fairfax Media. So let me start with the group. Just an open question. When you think about the acceleration of change that we're seeing in the industry, what is the single biggest challenge in developing a governance framework that works for the organization? If anyone wants to kind of jump in, but is just starting there? Maybe we can start here. No?
The biggest challenge in the... Hello? We on? Is the mic good?
Yeah, I think
okay, good.
So the biggest challenge when you think about creating a governance framework, kind of where do you start?
Yeah, well, governance is a combination of risk management and leadership, in my opinion, and they're often going to run into each other, right? Because the leadership issue is about trying to challenge the assumptions and do things differently, but the governance framework is often about risk management or risk minimization. So I think this comes down to a leadership issue, and we have to decide what's the most important for the organization. Is it to manage risk, or is it to experiment to learn how to be more effective? You've been talking about customers being at the center of everything, and it's true that they're actually at the center of every organization. And so we constantly have to be looking for ways to stay relevant and unique with them, and that needs to take precedence over the risk issues, in my opinion. So it comes down to leadership in terms of driving that visioning process and managing the risk on top of that. So let me hand it over to my fellow panelists to see what they feel about that.
So I think you're right. In practical terms for me, I think what happens is people get lost in the process and they basically try and control the uncontrollable. And that's the biggest challenge, is trying to figure out how not to overdo it, I think.
Yeah. Colin, I'm curious from your perspective, and Chris as well, when you think about government and you think about the governance models of a government, and you're dealing with sort of a different level of risk, maybe you could talk to some of the challenges that as it relates to
sure. I mean, firstly, I need to declare that I'm a recovering member of the private sector.
Okay.
Now that I'm a public official, I feel I have to say that. And look, I think the challenge here is one of integration rather than separation. We often talk about people, I mean, you yourself talked about leadership being the business of innovation and governance being the business of managing risk. For me, inherent in that is actually the problem, because I think governance is the business of deciding what level of innovation you want to have and where you want to have it, and then treating that appropriately depending what treatment means. And in some cases, and in some parts of government, and in some things that government does, you have to, and in fact, wherever you work, you have to make active choices over what your risk tolerance is. And then your governance processes are all about trying to hit that sweet spot. So sometimes your governance process might actually be saying, you're not doing enough here. You need to take more calculated risks in this area. You may have heard this before, but Rob Fife, and given Rob's award last night, which I thought was fantastic to see. Rob Fife tells a great story about the Air New Zealand business, and he talks about grab a seat. And very briefly, grab a seat was an innovation. Nobody else had done it before. They had no idea how much money they were going to lose. They figured out it could be quite a lot. So they contained it to 6 months. Said, look, if at the end of 6 months this is tanked, we can stop. We won't sink the organisation. He said, so we went on gut feel. We went on basic information. He said, anyway, the story is we launched it. It was fantastic. But we had no idea whether that would work or not. And then the killer, he said, don't worry, we don't take that approach with our engineering services. And anyone in the room who flew was very pleased about that. So I think it's a case of integration, not a case of separation. Bring the two together, decide what risk you're willing to take in which part of your business, and then govern it in whatever direction you need to move that risk profile.
Okay. Chris?
I can't disagree with that. I think, though, my experience is, and God bless you for about what you're going to be doing here in New Zealand, in kind of the consolidation, standardization, simplification, my words. But what I find most frustrating about governance is simply the fact that in governance committees, when you're doing the types of efforts that you're going to do, it all comes down to individual need. It's who is going to fight you for, who will not allow you to take their perceived power and money and status away. And we can talk about risk and we can talk about all that, but fundamentally it's about the individual, and fundamentally it's about people not wanting to share and give up and participate in the whole. They want to run their own organization, they want to depend on their own IT staff, their own CIO, whatever it is. And to me, or at least my experience, has always been, how do you use governance to address this issue of the greater good versus the individual? And I, for one, have never been able to deal with that. So I agree at a higher level, risk and all of that, but at a fundamental, it's how do you get over this need, individual need.
That's fascinating. So, Andrew, when I look at your business, which is in a fast-moving, innovative business that's been changing dramatically, I would guess that oftentimes you're aware of the need to change, the organization's aware of the need to change, and it's a partnership that is. It's a natural discussion that forms. Do you find in your sectors that that's hard? It's hard to drive that discussion. To your point on power, it's very difficult to say, no, you got to pay attention to this because it may feel okay for you, but it doesn't feel okay for the rest of the organization. And Peter, I'd be curious from your standpoint, how do you empower people to, or frankly force that issue to make people have that conversation?
So, you want to go with it first?
Nope, you can go first.
Well, to me, it's about building ownership of the vision. So I've talked a lot about having the vision as the catalyst for driving innovation, because without that vision, it's just a random walk. So what I like to do, and what I do with organizations, is get everybody involved in the ownership of the development of that vision. And that brings out a lot of these discussions and turf battles and asset control issues, and creates a platform for everybody buying into the common vision for the organization. So when that vision is being developed, I'm not talking about having the CEO or even the CIO come up with that. I'm talking about a collective ownership of that process with the organization stakeholders, and getting buy-in across all the functions as that thing is developed. So it's much harder for that kind of activity to take place when you've done that.
Yeah.
Even without buy-in, though, that discussion, that I agree with you, there's inevitably some power-based management that goes on. But there might be an alternative approach to cracking that nut, which is taking a risk-based view, right, and using that discussion to strip away people's concerns. Because typically if somebody says, we shouldn't do that, they're not going to say, because I don't want to give up my power base. That would be vulgar. So they'll typically say something along the lines of, I think that poses an unacceptable risk to the safety engineering function, which is, at least on the face of it, a legitimate tactic. But if you just say, okay, let's buy that, let's work our way through that discussion, even if they don't agree with you, it's sunlight, a bit of disinfectant.
And I think the other thing in this space is, because I couldn't agree more with the power play issue, and having worked in government and in a multinational oil company, I'm not sure which was more political, but that's alive and well and will still be alive and well. And it does come down to figuring out what the incentives are and aligning the incentives, because sometimes the incentives may, on the surface, appear to favour a risk-averse approach. In the early part of my career in ICT, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. I'm not sure that still holds true, but certainly even in those days, it was pretty clear what you didn't do. So there's a lot of incentive sitting behind what you don't do. Can we shift the incentives towards what you do and what you actually do achieve? And that can be much harder in government than in the private sector, because it's much harder to define or at least to define and measure the outcomes in the near term. The outcomes tend to be measured in the much longer term, so harder to get the incentives aligned.
You're a much better politician than I am. I think it comes down to guerrilla warfare. I mean, it really is. It is getting down, rolling up your sleeves, and just fighting the good fight. And God bless you, and hopefully you'll be. But there's no guarantee that even on the other side you're going to come out.
Yeah.
I think it is a game of oftentimes patience and fortitude, and just waiting it out.
If I can share with you what they found, what the Collins and Porras research found about changing the established organisation is. They actually concluded it was a matter of getting the right people on the right seats on the bus before you come up with the vision.
Right.
What did they mean by that? What they meant was you had a critical mass of people internally who wanted to change the organisation. They didn't know how they were going to change it, but that critical mass of people who were willing to do the heavy-duty, heavy-lifting organisational change was actually sufficient to override the interests of any one department or any one individual. So if that's the empirical data. It says critical mass is important. Get that in place first. People who know this is going to happen, but they're going to work through it and they're going to work around it.
Interesting. Even when that one person is the CEO that you have to convince?
In fact, what Collins and Porras found is that the visions that were ultimately developed for these organisations that transformed themselves were not developed by the CEO. They were developed lower down by this critical mass. Obviously, people who had enough stature in the organisation and influence to have an effect, but it was not the CEO getting in a sports car, driving off into the sunset and coming back with an epiphany. Right. It just never happened that way.
Right.
That's how startups work, but it's not how established organisations work. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that can address this issue of how do I actually get the resistance managed and get everybody lined up.
The challenge that I have, or had, I should say, I am, as you said, recovering, is the problem is that government institutions are by their nature very political. And so because they are based on politics and based on the tenure of people within that environment, they're not rational. And so you can spend a lot of time doing all of the things that we talked about, that you brilliantly talked about this morning. But because they're not rational, it may never actually come out that way, and you have no control, or you may never get anything done. Maybe my experience in San Francisco is unique, but I oftentimes joke that in San Francisco we eat our young. I mean, it is so political, it is so uber-democratic that you have this environment where rationality does not rule. Right. And I don't know if that's true of other, government organizations. And the federal government in the United States is just so large and diverse that you don't actually get that in such a concentrated form. So my challenge in San Francisco was always, how do you do it? How do you impose rationality in an irrational world? And again, it is, I think, back to what you said, is the incentives. And it is the guerrilla warfare of going person by person, leader by leader, wherever you have to go in order to figure out that incentive, and doing a big chess play, keeping it all in movement so you move everybody around and everything around to get what you want.
Can I pose a different view?
Sure.
My fear is that creates a reactive government, right? And where people don't think long term and they don't commit to visionary investments. And they all sit back and wait for the next election, and then who's going to be in power, and let's deal with the guerrilla warfare there. And I think that's dysfunctional government, personally, and I think we have to get around that. And I have seen it happen. And let me give you an example. I worked with a peak body in Australia, in the state of Queensland, Local Government Association of Queensland, voluntary organisation representing the interests of local councils throughout Queensland. And that peak body looked like it was going out of business because of amalgamation of councils. And the advice I gave them was, look, come up with a vision for what local government should be doing across the state of Queensland. And let's engage all of the members to figure out what that is. So they did it. Part of the discussion was go to Canberra and see what Canberra thinks about local government. So we went down to Canberra and we said, what do you think about local government? And they said, we love the South Australian model. Why do you love the South Australian model? Because when we got into power, I was appointed the Minister for Local Government, and I knew nothing about local government except my own local council. And I was looking for a policy statement and a policy view, and the South Australians walked in and they presented us with a vision for what local government should be doing, and we said, thank God for that. And that's now our policy. Right? So government will behave, they're being very rational, of course, by embracing that policy. Why? Because now they can go out and articulate to the nation, we have a vision for local government. And because we're going to follow that vision, we're going to get re-elected.
Yeah. That sounds like a local leadership problem in the government, perhaps.
I think to assume that government knows what they should be doing and what policy discussions they should be having to get re-elected, I think is a gross overstatement.
So actually, we have a question on the shout box, and I just want to remind you guys to please use the shout box for questions. But sort of to that thread, there was a question, Colin, posed to you, which is, what do you see as the key challenge that's keeping the CIO, and when you think about the governance model, from reporting directly to the CEO in the majority of government agencies?
The same challenge that's keeping CIOs away from the top table in the private sector.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's been interesting. We've been having quite an interesting discussion in government about government, the government CIO role, and should it be an independent role? And I think that's a really legitimate question. I did one of these, comprehensive exercises one Saturday morning by going onto Google and checking a few banks' websites and checking a few airlines' websites. Almost none of these organisations had the CIO at the top table. It's really interesting. It wasn't the case when I was in, it was exactly how it was when I was in, I had an ICT leadership role in ANZ. I was a senior exec, but I had 5 or 6 other areas I looked after as well. And it hasn't changed. So it's a private sector issue, it's a public sector issue. And I think the big fear that people have, the big concern that they have, is that ICT gets disconnected from the business, and hence, I think quite appropriately it needs to be anchored in whatever business it is that you happen to be in. So I don't think there's anything special in government in that respect. I think it's exactly as is happening in the private sector. I think if I could just one other thing that if you were to ask me what advice would I give to CIOs if they want to be at the top table, then is get interested in the business. That would be the single thing I would say, is get interested in the business. Forget the fact that you've got a particular function that you're leading. You've got to do that. But what you really need to do is to get interested in the business in all aspects of it.
So I'm curious for everyone's opinion on this. Don't you think so what I've found is the interesting shift is that CIOs who are interested in the business for the last decade have been interested in the business in terms of serving the business needs better with technology. But what's changed now is they have to help the business figure out how to grow the business by enabling technology. I'm seeing a lot of nods. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, as I said this morning, I do a lot of these meetings with CIOs, including in this forum and elsewhere, and I always ask what % of your time you're spending thinking about strategic issues versus operational issues. And strategic is usually around 10%. There's one reason why they're not invited to the table.
Yeah, right.
Because the senior management discussion is a strategy discussion. And if you're spending 80% of your time focused on operational issues, you've got nothing to contribute. So, and we have the same problem with ethics and compliance people. They're not invited to the table either.
So there was a question from the audience on when you're trying to evolve a strategy and drive a strategy, just building on that point, how do you guarantee a diversity of thinking on the team? Do you handpick those people to basically say, you seem like a really good thinker for this kind of a problem, or do you let the teams more organically form and then kind of hope for the diversity of thinking? I'm just kind of curious, when you want to drive innovation, you want to drive change, is there any fresh thinking on that?
I think that's a culture setting.
Yep.
I think as a leader, you need to set the dial to that degree of diversity, so that your expectation is, regardless of what level you're constituting a team, you hopefully will have access to that diversity.
Yeah, risk is okay.
Yeah, because the trick with diversity is making it productive,
right,
instead of it sort of devolving into a slinging match.
Yep. Any other observations?
Well, if you think about the processes involved in innovation, it's, understand, design, build, deliver, track, right? So understand what is the opportunity to create value in different ways that we haven't done before. That's basically a statement of customer problems and aspirations, right? Where's the unfulfilled, or the underserved problem or the unfulfilled aspiration? Who's going to go do that? And now I've got to come back and design the solution that's going to solve that problem or fulfill that aspiration. Then I've got to build it. Then I've got to make sure it's still fit for purpose. And then I've got to actually track it to see if I'm actually getting the support from the stakeholders that I want. Within your own organization, you'll have people that are good at those different things. It's just getting them to understand that those skill sets are different from the skill sets they're normally being asked to demonstrate. And so going through the organization saying, who's really good at identifying opportunities with customers? Who's really good at designing solutions that are relevant and unique? And you'll find those people exist throughout the whole organization. They've just never been asked to fulfill those roles before. So it's a matter of just taking them, and what I always like to do is I like them to self-select. Who wants to be on this role, in this layer of understanding what the opportunity is? Who wants to be on the design layer? And I've often found that you'll be really surprised by the answers. People come out of the woodwork and they actually view it as sort of a personal development opportunity to get into a role that they were never being asked to perform before.
One of the things I've seen in my career is that people get very, very confused about what's sustaining to the organization and what's reframing to the organization. They don't really understand kind of the frameworks and sort of what's really breakthrough thinking versus what's something that is, this is just same old classic cost reduction or classic sustaining innovation.
Right.
Do you guys have any suggestions for required reading or things that people would find helpful in order to get an education before they start this process? Because that can save a lot of time and a lot of harebrained ideas.
Well, I think we had a strong clue to that in your talk when you said, if you'd an hour before the end of the world, you'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem. I do think there's a real need to we're really slack at how we commission stuff. Getting really clear about the problem we're trying to solve. What is the presenting set of issues? What's the problem we're trying to solve here? To then be able to say, well, so what kind of solution is likely to work here? If that's the problem, is it a reframing or a sustaining? Which is it likely to be?
Right.
But we rush to start doing stuff, having not really thought about the nature of the problem.
Well, that's the shiny object problem that I think both you, Chris, and Andrew and Peter all talked about. It's a tough problem.
Yeah, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the stock standard.
Yeah.
Text, innovator's dilemma, innovator's solution.
Good.
Why good companies go bad. There's all these great books about how to get the mindset in the right place. But you're quite correct. What I often see is you ask, firms start to innovate, and then they say, oh, this is reframing.
Right.
And what they really mean is it's reframing to the organization. It's something the organization's never done before. But it's actually not reframing to the outside customer or the outside stakeholder.
Right.
And so the best thing you can do is involve the stakeholders in this discussion of, is it really creating value for you in a way that was not novel and unique for you? Nobody's ever created value for you in this way before. Because very often people fall into this trap is, oh yeah, internally we've never tried this, so it must be reframing. And they put all this money into stuff that actually has no impact on the customer or the stakeholder. So anything that gets mindsets around, let's start with the customer and the stakeholder first and see what those unsolved problems and aspirations are, is going to help with that problem.
I just want to go out. There are questions coming in on Shoutbox, but if there's any live questions that people have, we do have microphones in the back of the room. Let me just ask: are there any? I can't see the question. I have a question here from Shoutbox. Colin, for you. Today in this conference, we talked a lot about social and social being an integral part of the industry going forward. Chris, you talked about that as well in your talk, as did others. What do you think about the role of social in the context of the government and sort of a shared services model that you're driving towards?
I haven't even spent 30 seconds thinking about that. So there you go. There's an honest answer for you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pass.
Okay. Understood. Chris, any observations on that?
I was on a panel discussion about 4 or 5 years ago, and somebody asked me whether I thought that government websites were dead. And I said, absolutely. Absolutely. How many people go, to your website? How many people actually look at the information? How many, for all the time and money you're spending, do people really care? And of course, the answer was, I don't know. Well, I think if all of us are honest and look at that, the fact is that they're not coming to us. They're going to Facebook. They're going to Twitter. They now talk about resumes being 24 characters. Everything is moving in that particular direction. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with it, but to answer your question, I think that the social media strategy has to be central, foundational, core, whatever word you want to use, to your strategy, both as a CIO, but also in terms of helping your customers, the business units, achieve their value, because that's where everybody is. And I think, quite frankly, we are seeing that becoming the place where business is transacted.
Interesting. Business is transacted or business is influenced?
Both.
Yeah. Both. So speaking of sort of the role of a governance model and how the world is changing with these new innovations that are coming in, there's something that's existed for a long, long time because of the way IT is structured, which is the cross-charging model. Can you talk a little bit about, when you think about innovating with the line of business, does the cross-charging model damage the relationship between IT and the rest of the business because there's this sort of per diem kind of idea, or is that something you just kind of have to move beyond?
I'm having trouble understanding the
I mean,
question.
I do understand this one.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Run with it.
It took me a while to figure out what
Yeah.
I didn't hear it as cross-charging, but
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, of course it can,
Yeah.
if it's a bad one. You need some level of apportioning cost, however you decide to do it. And that apportionment might be corporate will take it all, or it might be business units will take it all, or it might be something in between. But the model itself, complex, cumbersome, difficult, these are the words that you tend to hear to describe people's charging models. So yes, of course they're going to get in the way if they look and feel like that.
Right.
So, what do you want to achieve? Figure that out, define the model that's going to help support it.
But the bulk of the charges that I slate back to the business are essentially maintenance, hygiene stuff, boring, keep the lights on, right? The real cost of the innovation activities is a pittance. So this hasn't happened to me yet. It may happen. I'm about to present our FY14 charging and budget model next week, actually, to a bunch of finance directors. Should be fun. But if that question comes up, my response would be, okay, so let's talk about the 3 to 4% of resource we're talking about here. Set that to one side and, just answer the simple question. Do you think we're good value or not? Because if we're not, we'll stop. No problem. You go outside. Right? Mm-hmm. But the bulk of cross charges that's meat and potatoes stuff. It's not, you're not sort of spending 30, 40% of the total IT expense on sort of hardcore innovation stuff, at least not in our industry.
I see your point, actually both of you, but I think the spirit of the question, which came in from an audience member, might be that, again, IT in a lot of the business constituents' minds is kind of in a box, and it's in the box you're talking about, which is make my PC run better, make my application stand up and not fall over. And if you start moving in this other direction, which is innovation and driving the business, does that breed kind of, can that breed kind of why are you guys focused on this? Why aren't you just focused on making my PC and making my hard drive work again? And I think that's what some of the audience.
Why should it be posed as an or question? Why can't it be posed as an and question? Right?
But
good point.
I think the experience is there'll be, I can certainly remember situations where you might want to have a strategic conversation, but, if half the PCs in the organisation aren't working, that's not the conversation you're going to have.
Right.
You're going to have the conversation about getting those damn PCs fixed.
Exactly.
So that's the sad reality for anybody inside a business, regardless if it's business or government, who provide services that are important to that business. You've got to be providing the services 24/7. You've got to be meeting your requirements. You've just got to be doing the business. If you're doing that, then you can have the strategic conversation. And I think back to the earlier question about why are CIOs sometimes not at the top table, because we're having to put too much effort into just keeping the business running. For whatever reason, be it delegation, be it underinvestment, be it poor choices, whatever it is, because that's the ticket of entry to have the strategic conversation. You're not going to have it if half the system's down.
Right.
Well,
Agree completely.
The structural problem is, of course, the IT resources are not allocated to the business. So if you had a customer-centric model and the IT resources were in there, guess who would be bearing that cost? The actual business, the customer segment, would be bearing that cost. And the only thing you'd be allocating is the infrastructure stuff, or the stuff that meets minimum acceptable accessibility standards for the whole organization. After that, all of the other costs would belong in a customer segment. So this is a problem we've created ourselves. We don't have to have this problem. It's just the way we've structured the organization.
I'd hazard a guess that there'll be a significant percentage of the audience whose organizations are organized just as you describe it, and there'll be a significant proportion that are organized in a more centralized model.
You want to ask?
And it would be interesting to find out, how often that's swapped over in the last 10 years. Because generally, structure, no structure is perfect, and the one you just described will likely to get a great deal of customer focus, and is also likely to drive costs upwards, and break down standardization and a whole bunch of stuff. So if we keep going to structural solutions, we'll end up with that kind of problem of having new problems to solve.
But why is that happening? That's happening. You know why that's happening?
It's happening because we don't have a clear
we get
vision.
totally confused about what we're optimizing to.
Right.
One of the first things in my speech this morning is be clear about what are you optimizing to. You're managing for efficiency or you're managing for effectiveness. And the reason the flip-flop occurs is because we're not clear about which of those really dominates. And something has to dominate, because when everything is equally important, that's not good strategy. You've made no trade-offs, and you get people to be confused and schizophrenic. So, I understand that happens, but that's just simply a lack of clarity about what are we really optimizing to sustain the organization in the long run. And my view is pretty clear about that. You better be effective before you focus on efficiency, right? Because if there's heaps of efficient organizations that have just disappeared. They've just disappeared. So do I not care about efficiency? Of course I care about efficiency. But is it equally important? No, it's not.
Well, I guess that would depend on whether your share price was tanking or not.
Well, there's only one thing that drives the share price, and that's the expected future growth, right? And the expected future growth is driven by what? Market share or customer loyalty. And what's that driven by? The relevance and uniqueness of your solutions to the customer.
Sure, but back to IT and sort of how you can drive change within IT. You said something I thought was fascinating in your talk, which is, how many from an IT department standpoint, how many of you are delighting your internal constituents? That's a place to start, right? I mean, let's just make a little bit of a separation between the business performance and whether you're delighting your constituents or not. Can I ask a question to the group, which is, do you all do internal customer satisfaction surveys? Do you guys do you study this to really track how well you're delighting your internal customers? I'm getting a nod here.
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to say do we really track it, but we do
Pulse it.
We do look at customer satisfaction. We do send people out to talk to groups of users to say, how is it really for you? And in fact, recently we've changed, and if Chris is in the audience, he'll confirm this, that we stopped going and talking to the managers only, and
right, because they have one perspective.
Because they had one perspective, and we actually go to people who are actually
on the ground,
more at the front line, and say, well, what do you think is actually happening? To just try and get a richer set of data.
Yeah.
Actually, on measurement, the bad news is customer satisfaction is a very misleading measure. If you look at the commercial world, actually satisfied customers are not loyal at all.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
switch
right,
all the time. So yeah, you talked about delight. It is about going beyond satisfied customers. It's about having proactive advocates of your organisation, which is much higher than satisfaction. But you're right, most organisations don't even measure satisfaction. And if they do, what they'll probably find is, roughly 60 to 70% of the organisation's stakeholders are satisfied. That's a pretty standard number. But if you said how many are actually advocates, that number is usually very, very low.
Or negative if you look at
Or
net promoter score.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or negative.
And so that's a different organisational challenge.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, for the audience, how many of you conduct internal studies of satisfaction? So about 2/3 maybe. So interesting. Did you want to?
I was just going to say we have IT satisfaction and irritations hardwired into our employee-wide engagement survey.
Okay, right. So you're.
I inherited that. It's fine.
So again, let me ask one more time. Any questions from the audience that we haven't gotten to yet?
You know what this means? This means everything we've said is either perfectly clear
Or they're ready for a drink.
or
Yeah,
they're probably ready for a drink.
I'll go for the latter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, or a latte. When you think about best practices and you think about kind of as we wrap up here, I would ask you all to say, what advice do you have in terms of creating this balance of a flexible organization that also can meet the day-to-day needs of the organization, but have an ability to help the company innovate and help the company drive new areas of growth? Does anyone from the group have any sort of parting advice to CIOs that are trying to build a more effective organization?
Be brave.
Great.
Be braver than you think you are.
Yeah.
I do. I think you need to agree on what kind of relationship you want to have with your stakeholders, right? So what level of advocacy do you want? And that's going to take you straight to the innovation portfolio, which is some combination of sustaining and reframing innovation. People always ask me, how much do I need to allocate to activities that are reframing or that get me above best in class? What does that portfolio really need to look like? And my answer is pretty simple. If you want to move the needle, if you really want to make significant movements in how your stakeholders feel about you or how the external customers feel about the whole organization, if you want to move that needle significantly, you've got to allocate around 40% of your innovation activity, attention to stuff that's getting you above best in class and or is reframing. Now, most organizations are miles away from that. So to get to that, what you really have to do is basically create two parallel innovation teams. Sustaining innovations, it's goodness. I mean, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you need to have a team that is continuing to leverage the assets that you've got. But running in parallel with that, you need a team that's going to do the reframing and get you above best in class. And at some point, you need to accept that that reframing stuff might eat the parent.
Yeah.
In fact, that's actually the mandate you have to give to the reframing team.
And you also have to
Is eat
protect
the
that
parent.
team. You have to protect that team as well.
And that's the leadership question, right? Don't confound those two governance models. They're fundamentally different innovation governance models. And you need to keep them apart, run in parallel, protect them both, and let them produce opportunities that will ultimately sustain the organization and its leadership.
Excellent.
Right? So I think that's the simplest thing you can do. Agree on what kind of relationship you want to have with your stakeholders. What does that mean for the innovation portfolio? What projects and things do I have to pay attention to? And how am I going to find that stuff and manage it? And that's two parallel innovation cultures in the same business.
Chris?
I can't disagree with being brave. It's a brave new world that we're moving into. And obviously I can't argue with you either, Peter. But I think the advice that I would give myself, actually, is this need to have a vision, to know how to lead and follow at the same time, and knowing when to do each becomes the issue. If we are truly going to show leadership, if we truly are going to solve business problems, if we're going to be in the position and have a seat at the table or whatever the metaphor is, we need to have a vision, we need to be clear about it and direct and make it simple. so that people get it and they will want to follow you. And you need, though, as a CIO, to be comfortable enough, confident enough in your vision and who you are to step back and say, okay, I've provided the framework, you fill in the details. And not get over heavy-handed about it and whatever, but let that evolve. And that's scary, because your job is not, your reputation, whatever's on the line. But you need to balance that and constantly be monitoring the situation and shifting constantly in order to make sure that you are leading and following and moving the ball down the field. And it's exhausting, it's tiring, because you're doing everything else. But that, to me, was what saved me over and over and over again. It was the constant being able to read my audience and then shift to what I needed to do.
I would, of course, agree with everything that's been said, just because you have to. But I would, actually, I think if you get clarity of vision for the organisation, where are we heading as an organisation?
Right.
I don't mind what structure you put in place, but for goodness sake, get yourself a decent ops manager. Get somebody whose day-to-day job it is to make sure that stuff just happens, it just runs. That gives you the headroom to contribute to the other side of the portfolio, which is actually the one where the real benefits can be sprung, where the game changers can happen. They can't happen if you're too worried about whether the lights are going to stay on. So get somebody who runs that for you, accountable to you. Get your energies put into the game-changing space, working alongside the rest of the executive team to figure out what that looks like.